Tuesday, January 7, 2003, at 7:39 p.m. Mine occurred in 1963, when I was 8 years old. I had become extremely ill with flu-like symptoms and had been unable to consume any food or fluids for nearly a week. My mother would call the small-town doctor with concern in her voice, but he would always assure her, without seeing me, that it was just the flu. I'll never forget the burning sensation I felt when I vomited only yellow bile, which I believe the doctor was not informed of. Then, as the days passed and I grew weaker, my vomiting subsided. My parents both worked and needed to get back to work, so I was alone during the day during the final days of my illness. On one of those afternoons, I was thirsty and needed a drink of water. I dragged myself away from the couch and I steadied myself before making my way to the kitchen sink in small steps. That glass of water tasted better than nectar, but when I returned to the living room, my vision became white and I passed out. I awoke on the kitchen floor later, and had no idea how long I had been there. That evening, I told my mother about the incident, and she looked concerned. I felt much better the next day, and even got up to play on the floor. I felt fine, but I was extremely pale, and my father insisted on taking me to the doctor regardless. I'll never forget the doctor's expression when he placed me on the examining table. One jab in my stomach around the appendix told him everything he needed to know. I recall the urgency in his voice as he told my mother to get me to the hospital as soon as possible. My father's work had taken him out of town that morning, and he wouldn't be able to be reached for several hours. My mother objected, and the doctor insisted once more that the situation was critical. That afternoon, he ordered an operation, and I was taken to the hospital for admission. The nurses worked quickly to remove my clothes and shave my stomach. Mom came in and out of the room, making phone calls to people who could assist her in contacting my father. Before the operation, the hometown doctor came into the room to see me and introduced me to another doctor who was a surgeon. I had no idea at the time, but the surgeon had driven 90 miles at breakneck speed to assist with the operation. My mother told me not to worry, but she sounded terrified, and I was wheeled into the operating room. Now I was terrified and began to cry. The nurses were stern, which made matters worse. I noticed a strange odor and complained about it. They lied and said it was the rubber on my gurney's wheels. They were getting ready to put me out with ether. My face was soon covered by a mask with a screen. The screen was then covered with a towel, and the ether was poured onto it. As I coughed and cried, I was told to take deep breaths like I was blowing into a balloon. My head began to swirl around my body like a planet in orbit, and everything went black. I realized I could think and wonder about where I was soon after everything went black. My childish mind's best interpretation was that I was floating alone in the vast, dark universe. Soon after, I noticed wisps of cloud-like creatures flying around with ease. As they twirled me around, they began to fly past me. They seemed to fly closer when they noticed my fear, and I became terrified. They were giggling and taunting me as they spun me around. I became so terrified that I cried out in agony and begged for it to stop. Something changed when I noticed myself floating upward and away from the wisps. I was once again alone in the universe as my fear subsided. I soon noticed myself floating upward to a large circular, cone-like formation dotted with sparkling stars. I could see it spinning as I looked up into it, and the stars were more concentrated near the smaller opening at the top. As I gained momentum, I floated upward until I reached the top of the spiral tube, where I encountered a sort of barrier resembling a bubble that had come to rest against something that had trapped it. I stayed there for a while, feeling no need to move. Then I felt a tug on my shirt from the other side of the barrier. I was grabbed by the arm and dragged to the other side of the barrier. A young man of about 25 years old had dragged me through. He was pleasant and seemed surprised to see me. He was curious because he didn't know who I was. Because I couldn't find my voice, I just stood there. Then a few more people gathered around me to take a look at me. They were elderly people who were very nice. When they asked who I was, I told them my first and last names, which prompted them to ask more questions. They claimed we were related, but they were curious about my father. I repeated my name and told them it was my father's name. They then appeared to gasp because they recognized my father. The older people introduced themselves as my father's grandparents and they were extremely gracious and delighted to see me. The two grandmothers hugged me and assured me that I was in a safe place because I was perplexed by what was going on. They referred me to the young man who drew me in. He was my father's cousin, and he was killed in the Korean War. I felt stronger as I spent more time in this place, and I realized it was warm and comfortable. I also noticed that we all radiated a bluish glow. They showed me some high-backed chairs in which they frequently sat. To me, the chairs appeared to be thrones. They showed me a chair that would one day be my father's, and then they showed me a chair that could be mine if I sat in it. I sat for a moment, but I didn't want to get too comfortable because I was curious and wanted to look around. Then they showed me generation after generation of my father's family, going back hundreds of years, with each person sitting in their chairs. They could be seen like steps on a ladder, returning to a brighter light. The older generation did not come forward to greet me, and I'm not sure if they were able to recognize me. However, younger generations appeared to at least say hello. During my visit with my father's grandparents told me to wait for a moment because a very special person was coming to greet me. They wanted me to meet an older woman who shone brighter than the others. She too expressed a great deal of love and affection for me, but hers was much more intense. This was a one-of-a-kind lady. I was completely enveloped by this woman's love and felt completely at ease, similar to an infant falling asleep in their mother's arms. She told me a lot of things, and I realized that the glowing light was God's presence. She claimed to be his messenger, tasked with reviewing my life. She had the ability to reach into my mind and extract memories and events from my life, which we watched together like a flickering movie. She seemed pleased with what she saw until we came across an incident in which I was furious with my older brother. We all stood there watching as I walked behind him and hit him over the head with a baseball bat. Steve sobbed uncontrollably, and she explained that inflicting such pain on another person was never acceptable. As she moved on to the rest of the review, I felt completely embarrassed. After the review, this special woman returned me to my father's grandparents and told me it was time for me to make a decision. I could either stay with them or go back and finish my life. My two great-grandmothers tried to persuade me to stay, and they encouraged me to return to my chair, which I did. But I was soon up and about again because I was unsettled. The special woman then told me that if I decided to stay, it would be very sad for my mother on Earth. I told them I loved my mother, and I didn't want her to be sad, so I wanted to go back. One of my great-grandmothers objected, saying that if I was sent back, it would destroy me because life on Earth was so difficult. The special woman told her that my decision to return had to be respected, and I was returned to the location where I'd been pulled through. All of the relatives were talking at the same time and seemed very concerned about me. They told me to finish my schoolwork and read my books, but at the same time, they seemed to be predicting my future. I recall hearing something about writing a book and getting married and having a daughter. I also recalled some heinous events, such as many tanks rolling over sand dunes during a war. To some extent, all of these predictions have come true. The same young man who had dragged me through in the first place was the one who had sent me back down. He advised me to let myself go and relax. The journey back down was less pleasant, and it happened quickly. The last thing I remember is slipping back into my sick body and remembering how it felt to be here. I immediately questioned why I had returned to such agony. When I opened my eyes, my living grandmother was holding my hand. I informed her that I'd been gone for a while and that I'd met her grandmother, who was very nice. As the other relatives in the room assured me that it was all a dream, she looked absolutely stunned. I knew they were wrong, but I couldn't argue because I was too sick.